25 years ago this week, on July 7th, 1996. This is the big one this week. The wrestling world changed forever with the most shocking heel turn in wrestling history. And the turning point for WCW as Hulk Hogan linked up with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash to form the New World Order at WCW's Bash at the Beach from Daytona Beach, Florida. I was not watching the pay-per-view live. I was a WWF guy. So, I would flip around between Raw and Nitro. But I wasn't paying for the WCW pay-per-views. But I remember hearing about what happened later that night, and I was floored. Because I grew up a Hulk Hogan fan. Hogan, Savage, Piper, Jake, Perfect. Later on, Demolition, The Hearts. These are all of the names, Andre DiBiase, that got me into wrestling. That was from my era, so I grew up on all that stuff, and Hulk Hogan was always the quintessential babyface. So it was shocking to find out that he would have turned heel. I cannot overstate how big of a deal this was at the time. The only thing I think that could have come closest to the Hogan heel turn, in more recent times, would have been John Cena turning heel sometime around 2011 or 2012. And that's if it was done correctly for Maximum Impact. Big if. Big if. Given the people who book these shows these days and write these television shows. But even then, even if it was done exactly, the right way, it still would not have had the kind of impact that the NWO angle had on WCW at the time. They were in competition with WWE, and this stuff single-handedly turned the tide for them. There has not been anything comparable in the wrestling world since then. And, these days, we know too much. We're too connected through social media. And wrestling is treated like, it's treated like theater these days compared to how it used to be. Now it's treated more like a play than something that's treated in a serious way. I'm surprised we don't have credits rolling at the end of every show. And everybody coming out like a Broadway play to take a bow at the end of the night. But when Scott Hall debuted on Nitro, it was so well done. There were people believing that maybe he really was there invading on behalf of WWE. And then when Kevin Nash showed up and you had two of Vince McMahon's biggest stars walk out, just walked right off WWF television, right onto WCW TV weeks later. That got a lot of people interested in where things were going. Now you can understand why WWE loves their 90-day non-competes. I don't know if those guys had some kind of non-compete, but it wasn't long after their contracts were over, and there they were, on Nitro, fresh off Vince's programming. And it got a lot of people interested. And to his credit, Eric Bischoff, he milked the announcement of the third man into pay-per-view buys for this Bash at the Beach show, which was a 2-match show. I mean, the undercard is so underwhelming and unimportant compared to what happened at the end. But I will say, having gone back and watched it, the opener of this show with Rey Mysterio and Psychosis was fucking fantastic. One of the best openers to a pay-per-view that you will ever see. Just watch the opening match and the closing match, and that's really all you need. But the genesis of the NWO idea is actually rooted in something that Eric Bischoff saw in New Japan Pro Wrestling. There have been plenty of invasion angles in wrestling, even before the NWO, other countries and stuff. But in Japan, at the time, you had the UWFI, which was basically a shoot-style wrestling promotion. They entered into an agreement to work with New Japan. And a lot of the UWFI stars lost to the New Japan stars, except for one very important match, where Takada, who was, their main guy, representing UWFI, or one of their main guys, defeated the Great Muta, Keiji Muto, to win the IWGP Heavyweight title. And this was a big deal, to have a non-New Japan star walk in and win their championship. And then months later, in fact, it was the month before Scott Hall walked out on Nitro, Takada defended the title at the Tokyo Dome against Shinya Hashimoto. And guess who was in attendance that night at the show? Eric Bischoff. So he got a first-hand view into this working relationship, into this, invasion of sorts. And on Talk is Jericho last year, Bischoff had this to say about the Japanese influence on the NWO concept. I was spending a lot of time over there. I was studying what was working in Japan, because the business at New Japan in 93, 94, they were hot as hell. They were putting 60, 80,000 people, 100,000, well, he's exaggerating now, in the Tokyo Dome for the big shows. And here in the US, WWF at the time and WCW were really having a hard time in the live event side of things. So to sum it up, I was over there kind of studying what worked and the differences between the way the product was presented in Japan and here in the States. And one of the things I noticed is that it was so much more real there. The storylines, the characters, the action in the ring was more reality-based. And here in the States, it was more character, kind of comedy, cartoonish. And in studying it, I was kind of watching the intercompany wars and that kind of thing, and that's where the idea started. Hall and Nash told Bischoff to get 3 WCW guys together, and they would get a third man of their own for a 6-man tag at Bash at the Beach. WCW chose Sting, Randy Savage, and Lex Luger. Luger's name was the most talked about as, possibly turning on WCW. Luger's going to be the third man. Even during the match, Luger got taken out early. And I'm sure there were a lot of people who thought he'd be coming back out later in the night as the third man. Because Hall and Nash, when that match started, they started it without the third guy. It was 2 against 3. So they kept people thinking and wondering and waiting right up until the very end who this third man was going to be. The Luger turn would have been predictable. Bret Hart would have been a great choice. He was on break from WWE at that time. He had not been on television since the Iron Man match with Shawn Michaels. He was one of the company's biggest names. But even Bret, even though Bret would have been a good choice, he still would not have had the impact that Hogan did. I mean, to be fair, nobody would have. But they had sent feelers out to Bret. He had turned them down. There is this story out there that Dave Meltzer had predicted in The Observer that Mabel would be the third man, which is actually not what he said. He reported that Mabel's name had been discussed as the third man. Mabel was one of many names to be discussed. Not that he actually would be the third man. He also mentioned Crush was another name that was discussed, and that would have sucked. Can you imagine? Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and fucking Crush. But the following week in the newsletter, Meltzer said he expected it to be Hogan. But I guess it makes for a better story to claim that he said it would be Mabel. So I have to defend him on that because that's actually not what he said in the newsletter. But Hogan had been off WCW television for a few months by this point. He was filming a movie, and he was not committed to be on every show anyway. So he was off filming some kind of movie, and he had dipped his toe in the heel waters the year before while he was feuding with the Dungeon of Doom. He went through this period where he ditched the red and yellow. He was dressed in all black. I think that was a little experiment to see how the people would respond to it. But it took some convincing by Bischoff to get Hogan to even consider turning heel and being the third man, even though a lot of people had soured on Hogan and they were bored of him. He was still their biggest babyface. And, business-wise, he still had an impact on pay-per-view buys, on ticket sales. Maybe not as much as he used to. But it was a risk. It was a risk for the company, and it was a risk for Hogan. Bischoff talked to Sports Illustrated for a 25th anniversary story on the NWO recently. He said, I had approached Hulk a little under a year earlier about turning heel and changing the direction of his character. He was not interested. During the next few months, it became a little more obvious to Hulk that the red and yellow guy from the 80s wasn't working anymore. He knew it, I knew it, the fans knew it. But it took a few more months for him to realize it enough to make that change. Since Hulk had previously expressed that he wasn't interested, I approached Sting about being the third man. There are a lot of reasons why I have so much respect for Steve Borden, but one of the biggest reasons is, and I remember specifically talking to him on the phone while Hogan was off doing a movie, I asked Sting to abandon the babyface position he was in and take on that heel role, which was a big ask, and Sting was willing to do it. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall did not know who the third guy was going to be. Sting and I were the only two people who knew. That's when I got a phone call from Hulk, who was literally on location filming in the middle of some mountain range in California. He said, "Hey brother, I'd like to talk to you about what's going on. Can you make it out to California?" I said, "Sure, I'll come out." And I came to his trailer, which was basically his dressing room and his office. We had a 12-pack of beer on ice and a couple of Cuban cigars. We sat down, cracked a beer, lit a cigar, and he looked at me and asked, "Who's the third guy?" And I said, "I don't know, Hulk. Who do you think it should be?" And Hogan said, "Well, I think it should be me." At the time, Hulk never knew it was going to be Sting. That's how much of a secret that was. I wasn't 100% sure that Hulk was going to follow through until he literally showed up to the building. I was nervous as hell right up until he showed up and said, "Let's do this, brother." And so out came Hogan, late in the match with everybody down, and the crowd comes alive. Dusty Rhodes is fanboying on commentary, and Bobby Heenan goes, "Yeah, but whose side is he on?" And this has greatly irritated people that he would have said this and spoiled the big swerve. He didn't spoil it, and it did make sense for Heenan to say such a thing because he spent his entire career heeling on Hogan, going back to the AWA, and trying to tell people that he was a fraud, he was a phony. But I will say, I wish he would not have said it, because it planted that seed of doubt for some people. Not everybody, but it did plant that seed of doubt for people who maybe the thought just, they couldn't conceive of it. They hadn't even thought of it as he was walking to the ring, and then Heenan says it, and now in those 10 seconds or 15 seconds before he does the big turn, you've planted that idea in their head, and now they're at least thinking about it. Bischoff said it's like sitting at the World Series of Poker, knowing that you've got the best hand and accidentally showing your cards. He said he was disappointed when Bobby blurted that out. And I've got to agree with Eric on this one. I'm the biggest Bobby Heenan fan there is. But out comes Hogan. Hall and Nash clear out to the floor. And Hogan drops the big leg on Randy Savage. And then he drops a second one. He gets a visual pin. The match actually ended in a no contest. Any other time, this would be a sin to end a pay-per-view main event with no winner like this. But in this case, you can make an exception, given the big angle at the end. You have an angry, mean Gene Okerlund climbing into the ring to conduct an interview with the turncoat from Tampa. Garbage is flying everywhere. Gene got hit in the face by something, I think a bottle. The ring is just littered with debris. This is a sight to see. People were pissed. A fan got into the ring. Nash put him down with a right hand. Hall stomped on his head. Good. He should have stomped harder. This is edited out of the network version, by the way. So the only way you could see this is probably if you have the original VHS. But you will not find it on Peacock. You will not find it. It was off the network long before Peacock. But you definitely won't find it on that version now. But it shows how hot people were over this turn. And look, it got a lot of cheers too. Hall and Nash were getting some cheers even before Hogan came out. So it wasn't 100% heel heat. But the heel heat that they got was intense. And then came one of the most memorable promos in wrestling history, where Hogan dubbed it the New World Order of Wrestling for the first time. He says, "These two men have come here from a great big organization up north, and everybody was wondering who the third man was. Well, who knows more about that organization than me, brother? I made that organization a monster. I made the people up there rich. And when it all came time to pass, the name Hulk Hogan, the man Hulk Hogan, got bigger than the whole organization. As far as I'm concerned, all this crap in the ring represents these fans out here. For 2 years, brother, for 2 years I held my head high. I did everything for the charities. I did everything for the kids. And the reception I got when I came out here, you fans can stick it. Because if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, you people wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, Eric Bischoff would still be selling meat out of a truck in Minneapolis. By the way, Bischoff was a sales manager for a food processor, but he never actually sold meat off a truck. Says if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, all these Johnny-come-latelys you see out here wrestling wouldn't be here. I was selling the world, brother, while they were bumming gas to put in their car to get to high school. So the way it is now, brother, when Hulk Hogan and the New World Organization of Wrestling and the new blood by my side, what you gonna do when the New World Organization runs wild on you? Well, he did botch the name. I don't think New World Organization would have worked as well. Tony Schiavone had a great sign-off to the pay-per-view. He said, we have seen the end of Hulkamania. For Bobby the Brain Heenan, for Dusty Rhodes, I'm Tony Schiavone. Hulk Hogan, you can go to hell. We're out of here. Straight to hell. He slammed his headset down. Schiavone said, when I walked backstage after the show, I passed Brian Knobbs, who is a friend of Hogan. He looked at me and said, Hulk Hogan, you can go to hell. That was fucking great. And I just thought it was something that felt right. I was there in WWE in 1989. I knew what he meant to the fans. As I'm watching this, I'm thinking, man, it's one of the greatest heel turns ever. So I needed to sign off with something special. And that right there shows you the power of a great announcer and just a great announcing moment. Those are those memorable moments, and we don't really get those anymore. I feel like we don't get as many of them. So maybe sometimes people don't really appreciate the importance that a good announcing job can have on a big moment like this. Now, I can still remember when Bret Hart came back to WWE in 2010, the night on Raw when he attacked Vince McMahon. Might have been his first night back. Actually, no, it wasn't. It was a few weeks later. But he attacked Vince, right? I think he punched him and he was going after him. You would think Michael Cole on commentary was fucking catatonic. I still remember that, but for all the wrong reasons. I'm like, dude, show some life. I mean, I know these guys are a lot older now, but still, this is Bret Hart attacking Vince McMahon. This should be a bigger deal. And he's just like, you would think that he had no energy. There was no life to it. Again, the announcing can be so important in these big moments. But you will not find any other wrestler in history, at least not in this country, who was as central a figure and important a figure to business, both as a babyface and then later as a heel. I mean, we've seen people who are huge babyfaces. We've seen people that are huge heels. But to see two different periods in history, and you had Hogan as a babyface, as important as he was to that expansion, that national expansion in 1984, and then to see how important he ended up being to WCW as a heel in 1996. I mean, that just doesn't happen.